They thought they could scare me into destroying my own land. They thought a few HOA letters, a few threats, and a few $1,000s in fake authority would make me tear apart years of conservation work with my own hands. What they never expected was that the little piece of wetland they hated so much was protected by laws much bigger than their neighborhood rules. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been a wildlife restoration specialist living just outside Cedar Bay, Florida, a quiet coastal community where people move because they love the water, the trees, and the feeling that nature is still somewhere nearby. I never imagined that the biggest battle of my life wouldn't be against pollution, storms, or disappearing habitats. It would be against the people living 10 houses away from me. When I bought my property in 2020, it wasn't much to look at. It was a little over an acre of neglected land, mostly marsh, tangled vegetation, and standing water that most people would have called useless. The kind of place that real estate agents usually point at and say, "That's a problem area." But I saw something different. I saw a piece of Florida that was trying to heal. I'd spent years studying damaged ecosystems, and I knew that small wetlands could become lifelines for countless species if someone gave them a chance. So I spent weekends clearing invasive plants, restoring natural water flow, and planting native vegetation. It wasn't glamorous. There were plenty of mornings where I was covered in mud before breakfast, fighting mosquitoes the size of helicopters and wondering if I was completely crazy. My neighbors probably thought I was. But slowly, something amazing happened. Wildlife started coming back. First, it was small birds, then larger species, then eventually a group of roseate spoonbills began appearing over the water. Those bright pink birds looked almost unreal, like someone had painted them into the landscape. By 2022, my property had become part of a registered conservation partnership through a state and federal wildlife restoration program. The wetland received official recognition, and I received restoration funding to continue protecting the habitat. For me, it wasn't about money. Honestly, the grant barely covered the time and effort I had already put in. It was about proving that one person could make a difference. By early 2024, the property had become a monitored nesting area. Several spoonbill pairs had returned year after year, and seeing them raise their young became something I looked forward to every season. Then Denise Whitmore entered the story. Denise was the president of the Bayshore Palms HOA, and she was the kind of person who treated every neighborhood rule like it was a federal commandment. She wasn't evil in the cartoon sense. That's what made it complicated. She was organized, confident, and very good at convincing herself that whatever she wanted was automatically the right thing. She believed the neighborhood should look a certain way, sound a certain way, and anything outside that picture was a problem to be fixed. At first, her complaints seemed minor. She emailed me saying the birds were creating visual disturbances. Then she mentioned noise. Then she complained about droppings on cars parked near the community entrance. I invited her over. I showed her the conservation paperwork. I explained that these weren't random birds I could simply remove. They were part of a protected habitat restoration project. I remember standing there in my yard, holding the documents, expecting maybe a little understanding. Instead, Denise looked at the papers, looked back at me and said, "Ethan, I don't care what organization stamped that. This is still affecting our community." I told her, "It's not affecting the community. It's bringing wildlife back." She crossed her arms and replied, "Not everyone wants a wildlife experiment behind their homes." That sentence stayed with me, because to her, it wasn't a living ecosystem. It was an inconvenience. A few weeks later, I received an official HOA violation notice demanding that I remove standing water from the wetland area and eliminate what they called a nuisance wildlife attraction. They gave me 45 days to comply or face escalating fines. The amount they threatened was thousands of dollars every week. I remember reading that letter at my kitchen table and just sitting there for a while. Not angry, not even surprised, just disappointed, because I realized this wasn't really about birds anymore. It was about control. Denise didn't want a solution. She wanted the land to stop being something she couldn't control. And then, one early morning before sunrise, everything changed. I woke up to a strange high-pitched sound coming from outside my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was some kind of equipment malfunction from a nearby property. But when I stepped outside and walked toward the wetland, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There were devices mounted around my property line, pointed directly toward the nesting area. And in that moment, I knew someone had decided they were done asking. They had decided to take matters into their own hands. I stood there in the early morning fog, staring at those devices, like my brain was refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. I had spent years trying to bring life back to that little piece of land, and now someone had quietly installed equipment designed to drive that life away. There were 4 industrial bird deterrent units mounted on poles around the edge of my wetland, each one aimed toward the exact areas where the spoonbills had built their nests. The timing was almost too perfect. It happened right after Denise's deadline, right after she realized I wasn't going to surrender. I walked around the property trying to understand how someone could look at a protected habitat and decide the best solution was to attack it. The worst part wasn't even the machines themselves. It was the feeling that someone had been watching, planning, waiting for the right moment to make a move. I grabbed my phone, documented everything, and called Denise. She answered after several rings, and I could hear the confidence in her voice before she even said hello. "Ethan, is there something you need?" I asked her directly if she knew anything about the equipment around my property. There was a pause, just long enough. Then she said, "Those are deterrents. They're meant to solve the bird issue." I remember taking a breath because I wanted to believe I had misunderstood her. "You installed devices around a protected nesting area?" I asked. "You know these birds are part of a monitored conservation site." Her response was colder than I expected. "I know what you say they are. What I know is that residents are tired of dealing with the consequences." That was the moment I stopped seeing this as a disagreement between neighbors. A disagreement can be solved when both sides are looking for an answer. This was different. She wasn't trying to protect the community. She was trying to force an outcome. I told her those devices needed to be removed immediately. She told me the HOA had every right to protect property values. I told her federal wildlife protections didn't disappear because someone was worried about property values. She responded with one sentence that I still remember: "We'll see whose rules matter more." That afternoon, I contacted the wildlife officials who had been monitoring the sanctuary. Within hours, a field officer arrived at my property. I walked him through everything, showed him the nesting areas, the abandoned nests, and the equipment. The moment he saw the setup, his entire expression changed. He wasn't angry. He was focused, the kind of focus that tells you something has moved beyond a simple neighborhood dispute. He explained that disturbing protected migratory birds, especially during nesting season, could trigger serious legal consequences. And then he asked the question that changed everything: "Who installed these?" I didn't have proof yet. I had suspicion. But suspicion isn't enough. The investigation began, and what happened next was something I never expected. Investigators started looking into HOA records, purchase receipts, meeting notes, and communications. At first, Denise acted like she had nothing to hide. She told other residents that I was exaggerating, that I was making the HOA look bad, and that the entire situation was being blown out of proportion by one stubborn homeowner. Some neighbors believed her. That's the thing about these situations. The person with the most confidence often sounds like the person with the most truth. But confidence doesn't erase evidence. Investigators eventually found the invoice. The equipment had cost nearly $7,000, and the payment had been approved through HOA funds. But the most damaging discovery wasn't the purchase itself. It was the meeting records. In one HOA discussion, Denise had written that the goal was to make the wetland area uncomfortable enough that wildlife would stop returning. When I heard that, I had to sit down, because there it was, the thing I had been trying to explain from the beginning. This wasn't about cleanup. It wasn't about noise. It wasn't about protecting residents. It was about removing something she didn't believe belonged there. The irony was almost unbelievable. The same person who spent years telling everyone that HOA rules existed to protect the community had created a situation where the entire community was now facing legal consequences. The case moved quickly after that. Federal investigators determined that the equipment had disrupted the nesting area during a critical breeding period. The birds had abandoned their nests, and the damage to the restoration project was significant. I remember standing by the water one evening after the equipment was removed. The wetland was quiet, but it was the wrong kind of quiet. Normally, that place had movement everywhere. Wings, calls, life. Now it felt empty. I kept thinking about those birds that had come back because someone gave them a chance, and how easily one person's decision could undo years of work. But I also knew something else. The story wasn't over. Denise had spent months believing that the HOA was the most powerful force in the neighborhood. She believed a violation notice and a fine could control anyone who disagreed with her. She was about to learn that there are some things even the most powerful neighborhood president cannot simply vote away. The investigation turned into a federal case, and suddenly the woman who once stood in front of homeowners' meetings telling everyone else to follow the rules was the one answering questions about breaking them. When prosecutors announced the charges, the entire neighborhood changed overnight. Some residents were shocked. Some were embarrassed. Some admitted they had quietly disagreed with Denise for years, but never wanted to challenge her. And for me, watching everything unfold was complicated. I wasn't celebrating. This wasn't a victory party. A protected habitat had been damaged, and no legal decision could completely undo that. But there was something powerful about seeing accountability finally catch up. Denise had spent so much time trying to control a piece of land she didn't own. She forgot one simple thing. Nature doesn't belong to an HOA board. It doesn't belong to the loudest person in the room. And it definitely doesn't disappear just because someone writes a complaint letter. As the case moved toward trial, the evidence continued piling up. The question was no longer whether Denise had crossed a line. The question was how far the consequences would go. And when the final decision came down, even I wasn't prepared for what happened next. When the final decision came down, I remember sitting in my truck outside the courthouse for almost 10 minutes before I even turned the engine on. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't smiling. A lot of people expected me to feel like I had won some kind of personal battle against Denise Whitmore. But honestly, that wasn't how it felt. The truth was, there was no real winner when a place you spent years protecting gets damaged. The birds didn't get their nests back. The lost breeding season didn't magically rewind. The quiet mornings I used to enjoy before all of this happened were gone forever. But there was something important that came from that moment: accountability. For months, Denise had believed that confidence, authority, and a position on an HOA board could protect her from consequences. She had spent years telling other people what they could do, what they couldn't do, and how they needed to follow the rules. But when the investigation reached the federal level, those same ideas of responsibility and enforcement finally came back around to her. The court determined that what happened wasn't just a neighborhood disagreement. It wasn't simply a dispute between two property owners. It was a deliberate action that interfered with a protected wildlife restoration project. Denise was sentenced for her actions and ordered to pay restitution for the damage caused to the habitat. The HOA also faced serious financial penalties, and after the legal battle ended, the organization that once seemed so powerful began falling apart. Insurance companies backed away. Residents started questioning years of decisions they had accepted without challenge. Meetings that were once controlled by one voice suddenly became filled with people asking difficult questions. And maybe that was the biggest change of all. People started realizing that a community isn't healthy when everyone is afraid to disagree. A neighborhood should not be a place where the loudest person automatically wins. It should be a place where people can sit down, listen, and understand that not everything unfamiliar is a threat. A few months after the case ended, I walked back into the wetland just before sunrise. It was one of those quiet Florida mornings where the air feels heavy with moisture, and everything looks almost golden when the first light hits the water. I carried my coffee, the same way I had done hundreds of times before everything happened. For a moment, I just stood there and listened. At first, I heard nothing, and I'll admit, a part of me was afraid that maybe the damage had changed everything permanently. Then I heard it, a sound I had missed more than I realized. The movement of wings above the marsh. I looked up, and there they were. The spoonbills were coming back. Not all at once. Not in some dramatic movie moment where everything suddenly returns to normal. Nature doesn't work that way. Recovery is slower. It takes patience. It takes time. But they were returning. One pair became two. Two became more. The wetland was slowly becoming alive again. And standing there, watching those birds move across the morning sky, I realized something. Denise had spent so much energy trying to remove something she considered inconvenient that she never understood what she was actually looking at. She wasn't looking at a problem. She was looking at proof that something broken could heal. She saw mud, water, birds, and noise. I saw a living system. I saw years of work, thousands of small changes, and a reminder that nature can survive if someone is willing to protect it. The strangest part is that people still ask me if I would do anything differently. They ask if I regret fighting back. They ask if it would have been easier to just drain the wetland, pay whatever fines they wanted, and move on with my life. And sometimes I think about that, because yes, taking the easy road would have been simpler. I could have avoided the stress, the legal meetings, the arguments, and the attention. But every time I look at that wetland now, I know I made the right choice. Because if everyone gives up when something becomes inconvenient, eventually everything valuable disappears. A protected habitat disappears, a piece of nature disappears, a community's ability to respect differences disappears. This story started because someone thought they could force a piece of land to become something else. They thought they could make nature leave by making things uncomfortable enough. But they forgot one thing. Nature has survived storms, fires, floods, and decades of human development. It doesn't need permission from an HOA president to exist. Today, the wetland is stronger than it was before. The restoration area has expanded. More wildlife has returned. And people who once ignored the property now stop by and ask questions. Some neighbors even tell me they never understood what I was doing until everything happened. And maybe that's the part I appreciate the most. Not the punishment, not the headlines, not proving someone wrong. It's seeing people finally understand why protecting small places matters. Because sometimes the most important battles don't happen in giant forests or famous national parks. Sometimes they happen behind someone's backyard fence, on a small piece of land that most people would never notice. And sometimes the person standing there protecting it is just an ordinary person who refuses to walk away. So, now I want to ask you something. Where do you think the line should be drawn between community rules and personal rights? When someone believes they are protecting property values, how far should they be allowed to go before it becomes control? And when protected wildlife is involved, should anyone who intentionally damages that habitat face serious criminal consequences? I want to hear your thoughts. Because this isn't just a story about birds or wetlands. It's a story about power, responsibility, and what happens when someone believes rules only apply to everyone else. Leave your opinion in the comments. Share this story with someone who cares about protecting nature. And remember, sometimes the smallest pieces of land can carry the biggest lessons.